Las Vegas police officer was on the 32nd floor during the shooting and theoretically could have interrupted the shooting. This is a huge breaking story of possible police cover-up. When it comes to reporting these events, they need to report them truthfully. We don't know for sure if there was a cover-up. We don't know for sure if there was honest mistakes here. We're still digging into that. But listen to my interview with Doug Poppa, where he picks up the story with these officers, with these two prostitutes.
Okay, well, it wasn't two Metro officers. It was one. According to the security supervisor, who's unnamed, he gave a statement, and I want to make sure I get the facts correct here. He gave a recorded statement to FBI Special Agent Jay Malika and to LVMPD Force Investigation Detective Hodson on October 12th, 11:56 hours, and that was over at the Mandalay Bay. And basically,
by the way, let me interrupt there and just ask, are we surprised at all that it was a joint FBI and Las Vegas police in this interview?
Well, when I saw these, and there were a lot of statements like this, what I noticed about it was we originally were told that the FBI's involvement in this was a joint investigation, but the FBI's involvement was because of the terrorist aspect to look, international, national, that the LVMPD cannot do, and then also the collection of evidence, either from Paddock's room or from the forensic evidence at the crime scene at the Route 91 Music Festival. But now we have agents, and this is not the only one I've seen, also being involved in the actual interviews with some of the victims and witnesses. So that's out there. So it is what it is there. So anyway, according to, and this guy they're talking to that's being interviewed is apparently a security supervisor and/or manager, whatever they call them over there, from Mandalay Bay, and he was armed the night of October 1st because supervisors over there are armed. And they basically start out and they say who they are. This is Detective Hodson, Metro. We're getting ready to interview, name redacted. And his name's redacted. So for my purposes, we'll call him the supervisor, security supervisor. And then they go on and they say, can you just tell us what your position was here at Mandalay Bay at the night? And that's redacted, but it's going to be security supervisor. So let's get to the heart of the matter. He says they had, well, I'll read it to you because it's specific. It's not long. He says around 2100 hours, which is 9 p.m., and this is again October 1st, the night, approximately, we had found two prostitutes, recognized prostitutes in a bar on the casino floor, Mazoya Lounge.
Yeah, actually, you know what? Let's go ahead and let's skip down to the part where they're going up the elevator.
Okay.
Well, because I might actually have this available for our listeners or have it read into it. But let's get to the fact that who got onto the elevator according to his.
We need to go
story.
Before that because the transmissions came over the radio. That's important to this whole thing of why I did the stories. So while they're in the office figuring out what Metro's going to do with these two hookers, the security supervisor says this. A radio transmission came over Metro Officer Hendrix radio. In other words, he heard over the police radio, quote, shots fired at the festival lot across from Luxor. He said, Officer Hendrix, which is D-R-E-X, looks at me and said, did you hear that? And they say, yeah. He said, so they both headed out of the office towards, I guess, the front of Mandalay Bay, because what was coming over the radio was that they are headed towards the Mandalay Bay, and they assumed they were the shooters. It was actually people who were running from the concert into Mandalay, but they didn't know that. So they start heading to the front of Mandalay Bay, and then he says this. But as we hit the craps tables, our radio transmission came from our security officer who was patrolling the hotel at the time, and that's Campos. It doesn't say it, but we know it's Campos. And he says his radio transmission was, control, shots fired, 32nd floor, 100 wing, I've been hit. And then the supervisor says, so as soon as we heard that, I yelled at Hendrix, the police officer, elevators, and we got to go to the elevators because he's getting shot up on the 32nd floor. He said, so we ran and we grabbed an elevator. Officer Hendrix and his trainee, because Hendrix is a field training officer. He had a female trainee with him, a police officer. He says, I don't know her name. It was her first day, but myself and we were in the elevator heading up to 32. So now they're heading up to floor 32 because Campos had called off and everybody heard I'm being shot on the 32nd floor. He says this, when we hit around the 23rd or 25th floor, our security radio traffic came on and said, shots fired on the 31st floor. So I pushed the 31st button because now they're getting reports shots on the 31st. He said, but he already pushed the 32nd floor button, he says, and so we're all going up to 32. So on 31, according to the security supervisor, and this is important, he says the training metro officer, meaning the girl, the female, her name was Varson, she gets off on the 31st floor with two other security supervisors. And he says this, me and Hendrix went up to the 32nd floor and we got off on the 32nd floor, and he says, we heard active shooting still going on when they got out of the elevator. So the cop interviewing him says, hold on a minute, Hendrix was with you on 32? And he says, uh-huh. And the cop says, so he left his trainee down on 31? Because they're not supposed to do that. And he said, yes, but the trainee got off on 31 with two of my assistants, two more armed security personnel from Mandalay Bay. So he says, and Hendrix went up with me to the 32nd floor. And then he says this, and this is very important. He says, when the elevator doors opened, we heard active semi-fire. It was basically, and then in parentheses in the transcription, they're saying that he's making gunfire noises at the time that he's giving the crew. And he says, we went to the 100 wing. When we came out of the elevator, the bank, 100 bank was on the right. We turned into the wing. I hugged the left wall at center core. He, meaning Hendrix, hugged the right wall because there were shots going on, and there was active shooting going on in the room from approximately 2 minutes more. About 2 minutes more, there was still gunfire going on. Then it got quiet. That was it. It was done. And he said, myself and Officer Hendrix with our weapons drawn on the room way down the hallway, then 4 more cops come up. That was the basis for my story. So according to this Mandalay Bay security supervisor, he was on the 32nd floor with the police officer. They were both armed, and for 2 minutes, they listened to the shooting going out the window, obviously, because it wasn't coming down the hall, of Paddock firing from the room. And basically, they took no action. And that's up for speculation. What could have they done? Well, you know, a lot of cops said there's a lot of stuff, but they didn't do anything. But they were on the floor for 2 minutes. So the last 2 minutes of firing, when Paddock was killing and wounded people, we have armed personnel directly on the floor listening to the gunfire.
Yeah, so let me just interrupt and say one thing. I'm going to read that part again. He hugged the right wall. Speaking of Officer Hendrix, he hugged the right wall, and there was active shooting going on in the room for approximately 2 minutes more. About 2 minutes more, there was still gunfire going on. So he says 2 minutes twice. It's possible, I don't know what you think, Doug, that you could add those 2 minutes together, and he's actually talking about 4 minutes because he talks about 2 minutes, and then he says 2 minutes more.
Yes.
It's a little ambiguous, right?
It could be 4 minutes, it could be the 2 minutes, or he just made the statement and he's saying again, yes, but that's up for speculation. But we do know this. At the minimum, he was armed. Officer Hendrix is on the 32nd floor with them. They're hugging the walls on each side because the shots are coming from the not down the hall, but they don't want to get shot maybe if the guy shoots through the door. And they're, you know, on the other side, but they're up there for 2 minutes while he's still firing. Right. And people getting killed across the street.
Okay, now let's talk about the Hendrix statement that was taken on October 7th, was it?
Okay, yeah, no, okay, remember this.
When is Hendrix statement?
Okay, the October 12th statement that was taken, given to the FBI and the Metro Detective was a recorded statement. So he didn't write this. And then this is the transcription of it. So that's the difference here. Now, on October 7th, which is a little strange, especially from cops who were talking to me from Metro, a week after, 7 days is a week after the massacre, Hendrix writes his officer's report or transcribes it, whatever he did, but that's his officer's report. Now, what's the problem with this? Well, I'll tell you what Hendrix says. Now, listen to the major discrepancies. I'll just cut down to the chase. And it says date and time of report, October 7th, 2017, and he's got his name on the bottom of it. So that's a week after October 1st. Now, just before I forget, Metro officers that I'm talking to, my sources are telling me something's wrong with this whole thing because they don't understand why these statements were taken so far after October 1st. Because if you're an officer at October 1st, you would go right to the station that morning or the next day and compile your statement and write it. Why this was done a week later, I don't know. But I'll also bring up something later on about the SWAT team story on that too. So anyway, let's get back to what Hendrix says in his report, and then I'll pull out the discrepancies. I'm just going to read the important parts, okay? Because it gets a little, well, you make your own determination on the way he writes this, okay? I heard an officer, this is Hendrix now, this is the police officer, I heard an officer get on the radio and say that there was an active shooter inside the Route 91 Music Festival, which I knew to be across the street from the Mandalay Bay Hotel. I then informed the security personnel that were in the office with me of the information I had just received, and I immediately got up and walked out of the security room door toward the front of the casino. Now, the reason why they're doing this, like I said before, is because the way the traffic was coming over, that they were headed towards the Mandalay Bay, they were assuming there were shooters heading toward the Mandalay Bay, and it was actually later on proven to be people. But they don't know that, so they think shooters are headed over to the Mandalay Bay. So they're going to head them off. So then he says, I then informed the security personnel who were in the office with me of the information I had received, and I immediately got up and walked out of the security room door toward the front of the casino. I knew that if I could come at the shooter or shooters from another side or a different angle, then we could surround and contain them from escape and keep them from hurting more victims. While heading across the casino floor, we received more information regarding the shooter or shooters. I heard on the police radio that at least some of the shots were coming from somewhere inside of the Mandalay Bay, about halfway up on the side of the casino closest to the Strip, and not just from the concert. Then he says something else that's not important. Then he says this. A moment later, one of the security personnel stopped and said that he heard over the radio that the shots were actually coming from the 31st floor. That's a discrepancy. I'll continue here. I then told him to take me there, meaning up to the floor. He directed me to an elevator, and I asked him if this was the tower closest to the Strip, and he said that it was. Then in parentheses, he puts this in, which is important. In parentheses, he says, it should be noted that Officer Varson, who was the female training officer, activated her BWC, which means body-worn camera, while still in the security office. I forgot to turn mine on until later, but he doesn't say when later. Close parentheses. Then he says, we then got into the elevator, and I realized that Officer Varson was right there with me, and he's emphasizing this, it appears, and I'll tell you why I think he's doing that. I realized that Officer Varson was right there with me, along with 3 security managers whom were identified as redacted, redacted, and redacted, because the names aren't in there. Then he says, as we rode up the elevator, I distinctly remember saying a prayer in my head for all of us in the elevator and the ones still dealing with the shots coming at them. Okay, this next paragraph is real important. At some point, I pulled out my firearm, as I do not remember doing this, but when the doors opened on the 31st floor, my gun was in front of me, and I was clearing around the corner and then down the hall to try and locate the shooter or shooters. The floor was quiet, and no one was in the hall. As I made my way down the hall, I had to stop, redacted, meaning security officer, from racing down in front of me, as I knew that he was a civilian and not wearing any body armor, and it was also my responsibility to be the first in the stack, meaning the point man. I told him to slow down and walk next to me if he wanted to. And he says this, while going down the hall, one of the guys said that there was a stairwell at the end of the hall. Once we were near the end of the hall, we heard a volley of automatic rifle fire start. The sound of the shots was so very loud and reverberated through the hall like thunder all around and above us. And then the next paragraph, he got the exclamation point. That's the next sentence. He says, above us, exclamation point. So he's emphasizing in this report, he wants to, from my standpoint, he wants people to understand that, hey, I'm on the 31st floor. That's why he says above us, exclamation point. Then he says, I could tell that it was coming from the floor above us on 32. I then told everyone to get back, and we retreated a few doors from the end of the hall. I know I hesitated and remember being terrified with fear, and I think I froze right there in the middle of the hall, but for how long I can't say. I do know that at 22:12 hours, I got on the radio and told dispatch that I was inside the Mandalay Bay on the 31st floor and that I could hear the automatic fire coming from the floor above us. And then in parentheses, he puts this in. I regret not being clearer in my radio traffic and saying the 32nd floor, 32 floor, because after hearing myself later, I said, quote, coming from one floor ahead, one floor above us, I stumbled my words, unquote. And then he says two more sentences. I once again hesitated as the shots was still being fired from the 32nd floor, and I remember saying a prayer in my head for God to keep us safe. I did not know what to do next. Okay, I'm not going to make a comment on that remark. I did not know what to do next. I remember thinking that I had myself, my day 2 trainee, which was Officer Vossen, and 3 security managers. Between the 5 of us, only I and Officer Vossen were wearing body armor, and all of us were only armed with a handgun each. The shooting stopped, and all I could think was to stop the shooter or shooters from becoming mobile and/or escaping. And then he says, at 22:15 hours, the last shots were fired, and then we made our way back to the end of the hall in the stairwell. So, according to this statement, and I'll point out the problem I got with it, he's saying that he never was on 32 with this security manager, which completely contradicts the manager's statement to the FBI. Not only that, but there's something big missing from his report. He completely has nothing in his report that he heard Campos over the radio saying he was shot on 32 and that the security guy told him, my guy's being shot on 32, because according to the security supervisor, that's what he told them, and they all went up to 32. So you have 2 separate reports with 2 major accounts, and they both cannot be true. Now, I want to say this before I forget, okay?
Go ahead.
When the timeline, I still think, for the record, something really stinks with this timeline. I still think there's something wrong here. But anyway, back in October, when Lombardo was changing the timeline, every week he would change it from 10:05 to 10 o'clock to 10:06. MGM got a little ticked off, and they made a statement saying that we don't believe Lombardo's statement. I think you remember that. So what they did was, if you remember, MGM released a statement, and they said this. I had it over here. I don't have it now, but it's somewhere in the file. But this is what they said in their statement. We know that at the time Jesus Campos called in over the radio that shots were being fired, that was about the same time that Paddock opened fire. And when he did that, there were 2 Metro officers with our armed security personnel, and they all responded immediately to the 32nd floor. That is in the statement that MGM released in October to the media. So why am I bringing that up? Because that statement pretty much confirms what the security officer was saying, that I did go to 32nd floor with Hendrix, and his trainee was on 31 with me. So what we have here, Jim, is this. We have 2 accounts that cannot be true. Somebody is lying here. Who's lying? We don't know. But I'm concerned why Officer Hendrix completely omitted from his report anything about the security officer Campos being shot on the 32nd floor, and that's what he was told. That's completely misses from his report. That's a pretty big thing to leave out of a police report. I don't know whether Hendrix not telling the truth. I don't know if the security officer is not telling the truth, the supervisor, but somebody's not telling the truth, because Hendrix cannot be on the 31st floor with all of them, and yet he's on the 32nd floor with just a supervisor when Paddock is firing for at least 2 minutes on the floor.
Go back to the part of the Hendrix statement where he says, I apologize that I got it wrong, or when I made my report. What was he referring to there? It almost sounded as if he was saying that when I called it in, I inadvertently said I was on the 32nd floor.
No. What he's talking about here is when he gets on the radio. He's saying he got on the radio, the police radio, he says, I'm inside the Mandalay Bay, and I could hear automatic fire coming from the floor above us. So he's saying here, I regret not being clear in my radio traffic and saying 32nd floor, because after hearing myself later, I said, quote, coming from one floor ahead, one floor above us, I stumbled on my words. So I think what he's saying is, when I got on the radio, I should have said, the shots are definitely coming from 32 right above me, and he's submitted. But what I have a problem with here, and I don't know who's telling the truth, who's not telling the truth here, it seems to me that in his report here, he's trying to emphasize the fact that the whole time he was on 31. And maybe he was. But if he's telling the truth, then we have a security supervisor from Mandalay Bay, from MGM Resorts International, who lied to an FBI agent.
Okay, let me interrupt you there. What about the statement from the trainee officer?
I'm still looking for that. That is in one of these 2,000 documents that were released on Wednesday. I haven't seen what she wrote. But her account could be to back this guy up. We don't know.
We need to see that. And then presumably there are statements by the other two Mandalay Bay security personnel.
And I'm trying to dig those out too. But the problem is when they release those documents, they're released on 26 files and nothing's in order. They have everything mixed up. I mean, they're police officers' statements, Mr. Witness statements. So you have to look
we know we've got a major problem just based on what you've read. We need to see what those other statements just to clarify that. But somebody is not telling the truth. Let me ask you this, based on your police training. Your Hendrix, let's say he was on the 32nd floor. He hears shots coming from down the hallway. He's by himself. He's hearing automatic gunfire. He doesn't know how many shooters there are. He has no backup. As a police officer, you are trained to do what in that circumstance?
I can't tell you what he would have done. As a police officer, you are trained to protect life, and he knew at that time, based on the radio traffic, like he said in his report, that people were being shot across the street. I can't tell you what any other police officer would do. I could tell you what I would have done and what police...
What are you trained to do?
You're trained to use common sense and to protect life. That's what you're trained for. You don't train for every specific incident. On something like this, if I was up there, I would have got as close to that door as I can, either put a couple of rounds through the lock or ran the room service cart. I would have tried to distract the shooter, who I knew at that time was definitely firing outside the window because he's not shooting down the hall. I would have done something to try to protect the lives of the people across the street. That's me. Now, okay, it's not only me, Jim. I talked to several police officers since yesterday, and they all told me the same thing. They were not going to stand by for 2 minutes knowing that gunfire was killing and wounding people across the street.
So to clarify, you're not trained to wait for backup.
Absolutely not. When somebody's life is threatened, that's why you put the badge on. You put your life over somebody else's life to protect that life. That's what you do as a cop. That's what I was trained. That's what I always did when I was a police officer.
By the way, I picked up one other interesting thing out of the Hendrix statement, which is that whether this was happening on 32 or 31, the story may be true, where he says he's heading down the hallway, and the security officer, who has no vest, is outpacing him. He's running to the action ahead of the officer.
Right.
That may have been happening on 32.
That's a very good point. Now, let's get back to the preliminary police report that was released on January 19th. And let's see what they say about these two guys' statements. I mean, not the statements, but let's see what they say. They don't say a whole lot. On page 6, and I'm going to give put my thing in when I'm talking on what I believe. Okay, on page 6 at the bottom of the 81-page police report, they say, I highlighted, as an active shooter incident was occurring, 2 LVMPD officers, which we know now are Vossen and are Hendrix and his trainee, the female officer Vossen. 2 LVMPD officers were in the security office of the Mandalay Bay handling a call for service, referenced 2 females who were in custody for trespassing. Those are the 2 prostitutes. There's nothing wrong with that. Both both Hendrix' statement and the security supervisor's statement does say that, so there's no problem with that. Then it says, next sentence, the officers heard the radio broadcast of gunfire at the Route 91 Harvest Festival. That's true. That also is in both statements, both Hendrix' statement and the security supervisor statement. No problem with that. Then the next thing we say, both officers, meaning the Metro officers, along with security personnel, exited the security office and responded towards the Las Vegas Village. That's true because that's also in the supervisor's report from Mandalay Bay, and it's also in Hendrix's report. He says that also. Now is where we're coming into a problem. It says, as they were making their way through the casino, security personnel advised the officers, meaning the Metro police officers, of an active shooter on the 32nd floor of the hotel. Then it says number 2 footnote, and it says information obtained from LVMPD body-worn camera. So we know by that statement that the body-worn camera that they got that recording off of was most likely Officer Varson, who in Hendrix' report says she turned on her body-worn camera inside the security office. Why is that important? Because that statement is omitted from Hendrix's report about anybody being shot on the 32nd floor or firing come from the 30th floor. That's where we start to have the split in the stories. Let's go a little further. It then says, page 6 going to page 7, the officers then directed security to escort them to that location. Okay, the location meaning the 32nd floor. But now it says this. The officers and security personnel entered the Senecor guest elevators, which was true in both statements, and were again advised the shooter was on the 32nd floor. Okay, that again is completely omitted from Hendrix's report. Then it states in the next sentence, the officers made a tactical decision to respond to the 31st floor and take the stairwell to the 32nd floor. That is a major discrepancy because according to the supervisor's report, the trainee Varson and 2 of his supervisors are armed, got off on 31, and he and Hendrix went to 32. So that's where we start having discrepancies. Now,
and it's the first time that we hear about getting off on 31 for tactical reasons.
Well, that's another thing because I'm a cop and I spoke to cops. Say, listen, I've been out of the business for years, 16 years in law enforcement, but isn't it a little strange that you wouldn't go to the floor where you have an officer, a security officer requesting help that he was shot, and that's where the shooter is? So that's a little strange. That needs to be explained by somebody. So now the only other mention of anything with Voss and Hendrix is now they actually mention their names in the 81-page preliminary report. On page 14 at the top, it says approximately 22:11 hours, and it says this one sentence. LVMPD officers Varson and Hendrix arrived at the Senecor area of the 31st floor and began walking up the 100 wing along with armed security officers from Mandalay Bay. That is another discrepancy between Hendrix's report and the security officer's report. So somebody's not telling the truth here. And I'm a little concerned, even if Hendrix is telling the truth, of why he completely omits in his 3-page police report any mention that the security officer and the shots were emanating from the 32nd floor. He completely omits that, and yet they say that in the preliminary report that Metro released. So we have a major problem here right now. Okay, yes, we have to find Varson's report to see what she's going to say, but right now the big problem here is this. Hendrix, in his report, is saying he's on the 31st floor with all the managers and his trainee, and we have a security supervisor who told the FBI in a recorded conversation that the trainee and 2 of his armed security people got off on 31, and he went to 32 in the elevator with Hendrix, and of course, you know what we already said, they're on the floor for at least 2 minutes hearing gunfire. This is a major discrepancy because...
What do we know about Officer Hendrix?
We know nothing. I know nothing. I never heard of him.
Do you know how many years on the force?
I don't know how long he's been on there. I don't know anything. I'll tell you this morning when my stories came out, I wrote 2 stories last night. One was about this, an armed personnel, 2 armed personnel on the floor while Paddock was still firing. And then we'll get into the SWAT story. Then I wrote a story on the SWAT that they were told not to respond to Mandalay Bay. I'll talk about in a second. Then this morning, early in the morning, I was up all night. I'm looking at these 2,000-page documents, and I see Hendrix's report. And I start reading it, and I said, wow, that's completely opposite of what the security supervisor says. So right now, we have a major problem. Somebody here is not telling the truth. You cannot have it both ways. You can't say both of them are telling the truth. No, they can't. Because if Hendrix is on 32 with the security supervisor for 2 minutes while Paddock's still firing, and his trainees downstairs, if you believe the security supervisor at Mandalay Bay, then Hendrix's report is not true. If you believe Hendrix's report, then the security officer lied to the FBI and to the port. So the next question would be, why? So right now, we have 2 different versions of something that's real important here. And like somebody calling up this morning said, what's the big issue? I said, the big issue is this. You have 2 people with guns, albeit handguns, but with guns, on the 32nd floor, if you believe Mandalay Bay, while the shooting was going on for at least 2 minutes from Paddock's room while people were getting killed and wounded across the street. That is a major story. That is
well, it seems to me you have two potential reasons for cover up here, and hence the discrepancy. If the supervisor's story is true, the police may want to cover up the fact that they reported to the 32nd floor and failed to take action despite the fact that shots continue to fire for 2 to 4 minutes. Or I guess there's a possibility that Mandalay Bay supervisor is not telling the truth. It seems to be less likely that that be the case. The only incentive for that I could think of is that for MGM liability purposes, they want to be clear that we heard that there were shots on 32 and we went to 32, because otherwise you may question, wait a minute, MGM, you've got an armed security guard, one of your guys has been shot, and you don't go to the 32nd floor? You go to 31? Right?
Right. And another thing here on the preliminary police report, on page 14, it's titled approximately 22:12 hours. Excuse me. They say this: 2 armed Mandalay Bay security officers exited the guest elevator on the 32nd floor and went to the center core. So now they're saying in the preliminary police report that while the firing's still going on, because at 22:12 the firing didn't end to 22:15. 2, what they don't name them, 2 armed Mandalay Bay security officers exited the guest elevator on the 32nd floor and went to the center core. Paddock fired approximately 80 to 90 rounds during this time into the Las Vegas Village area. Paddock fired an unknown number of rounds into Las Vegas Village, and that's what they're saying. So now we have 2 more Mandalay Bay security officers, according to the preliminary report, they do not name them, who now get off the 32nd floor elevator at 22:12, which is still more 3 minutes of firing, while people, we don't know who they are.
Yeah, so we have yet another discrepancy, right? Yet another version of this story.
Yes.
But here's a possible innocent explanation, and that could be that the supervisor in his report misremembered. He remembered that he got off on 32. He thought it was Officer Hendrix that was with him. In fact, it was another Mandalay Bay security officer.
No, I'm not going to buy that. I'm going to tell you why. Okay? Because in his 15-page transcript of his recording, the cops and the FBI guy that interviewed him, they asked him multiple times, even at the end, which was a good interview. They go back and say again, tell us what happened. And he says it again, exactly what he said about Hendrix. And I'll tell you this, Jim, forget that I'm an ex-cop. Okay? If I'm a security officer, all right, now we got the guy cutting grass out there, so we may have some background noise. If I'm a security officer and I'm on the 32nd floor, which turned out to be the shots I'm hearing, later on I find out is the killer in the worst mass shooting in modern American history, I am not going to forget till the day I died who was hugging that floor with me and the name of that officer. Till the day I die, that would be sunk in your head. So that's why I'm tending to believe what the security supervisor is saying seems plausible to me.
I don't disagree with you. I think as we look for the Varson statement, we should also see At any time, did this supervisor give a second statement where he somehow revised what he said in the first statement? We should look for that.
Yeah, so far I haven't seen anything. But then even if he revised it, then he go back and say, well, how do you revise something that's specific?
As I think about this and try to figure out who's telling the truth and who's not, you have to consider that the Mandalay Bay security officer was being interviewed in a live interview by 2 Las Vegas Metropolitan Police officers and a member of the FBI. Whereas Hendrix was filling out a police report. Where is it easier to lie? When you're filling out a police report about a week after the incident and you have time to gather your thoughts and think about what you want to say as to what happened, and you're simply writing it down, versus if you're being interviewed by the FBI and 2 police officers. It would have been a felony to have lied to the FBI. That Mandalay Bay security officer had no motivation to not tell the truth as to where he went. Hendrix, on the other hand, obviously had some motivation to not report that he had gone to the 32nd floor. I don't think there's any question in my mind what really happened, and that's that, in fact, Hendrix was on the 32nd floor and did hear shots being fired for at least 2 minutes, maybe even 4, based on the report of the security officer. And it just makes me sad. It makes me sad to think about what could have been if he had taken action, how many lives could have been saved. It also makes me sad for him because of the guilt that he must feel. Can you imagine being in his situation? He's on the 32nd floor and all he has is a handgun, and he's hearing machine gun fire from down the hall. He knows that if he steps into that line, down that hallway, he's putting his life at serious jeopardy. A lot of people would say that it was a smart move of his to wait for backup. You don't enter into a dangerous situation like that without backup. But he also knew that there were shots being fired at the festival. He had to put 2 and 2 together in his head that those shots were coming from the hotel. So he knew when he's hearing this gunfire, or should have known, that he was raining bullets, that the shooter was raining bullets down on thousands of people. In that situation, based on conversations Poppa reported to me of other officers or former officers of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, they believe your training tells you you go to where the danger is. They are trained to go into the danger, even without backup. If you've got a serious situation like that, a mass shooting going on, you do whatever you can to distract that shooter. It's also sad that Hendrix apparently chose to lie about it. And who knows who else above him participated in that lie? Who else did he tell the story to when he came back to the department as to what happened? He likely told others that he was on the 32nd floor. Perhaps they're the ones that convinced him you don't want to report that you were on the 32nd floor. We did some digging through the documents, and we did find the trainee's report. That's Officer Varson. That was his trainee. She reports that everyone got off on the 31st floor. That's not surprising. Again, this is in a police report filled out about the same time as Hendrix's police report. She's his trainee. No doubt he worked with her on that report, you would certainly surmise. Hendrix may have had another motivation to lie. According to our sources, leaving a trainee on the 31st floor while you go to the 32nd floor is absolutely against training. You do not leave a trainee alone in a situation like that. This was the trainee's first day on the job. There needs to be an investigation into this. The police need to provide further information about this, answer questions from the media, and be held responsible. We don't know for sure what really happened. We don't know if Hendrix is lying, but it certainly appears, based on the statements of the Mandalay Bay security officer to the FBI and to the police department, that he and Hendrix are on the 32nd floor. That certainly seems to be the more believable story.